The surge of Omicron cases in Missouri is documented through testing done in this University of Missouri laboratory. And the Mizzou lab doesn't need consent from anyone who is infected or not.
It starts with the toilet. People do their business and then they flush, which goes down the tubes and eventually ends up at a wastewater treatment facility. Depending upon the city, it might take a few hours or even longer for it to get there, but it mixes pretty well during the process. But eventually it gets to the wastewater treatment plant. At the wastewater treatment plant, as the influent is coming in, there is what we call an auto sampler that takes a sample every half hour for a 24-hour period and gets mixed together. And samples of those are what gets sent to my lab for analysis.
Dr. Marc Johnson is a professor of molecular microbiology and immunology. His lab collects about 200 samples every week from wastewater treatment facilities across the state. By the time people in his lab do their business, it becomes less dirty of a job focused on science.
We remove everything big, so we only have the small things like viral particles, and then we extract the RNA, which is what's the genome of SARS-CoV-2.
From this process, Johnson's lab tracks the spread of Omicron.
The very first place we detected it was in the Northwest, Kansas City and St. Joseph. But within a week, it had also sort of spread out and filled in the I-70 belt. So by the second week, so this was already a week before Christmas, we were detecting it in many of the St. Louis sewer sheds, many of the Kansas City sewer sheds, and many of the sewer sheds between them, either on I-70 or close to it, like we picked it up in Jeff City and I think Fulton very early on. So this is what you would expect. You would expect that, people flying in are going to come through Kansas City or St. Louis, and that's how they're going to enter the state. So that's where you would expect to see it first. And then a lot of travel along the I-70 belt, so you'd expect it to spread that way. And then St. Louis and Kansas City really went the fastest. By just before Christmas, it had largely filled out the sewer sheds. By the beginning of January, it's basically gotten everywhere. The last time we tested, I know every one of them had Omicron, and a lot of them get to the point where that is the only thing we're detecting.
Johnson has been keeping watch since early in the pandemic. That's when his lab partnered with the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources to track COVID-19 and its variants in the state. It's called the Sewer Shed Surveillance Project, which has a website with tracking tools for anyone to follow.
Coldwater Creek, it's kind of north of the airport.
As of Friday, January 21st, test results covering the St. Louis region show levels of Omicron in wastewater cresting, indicating the surge reached its peak. He says wastewater testing is reliable, having the ability to identify few cases among thousands of people.
1 in 1,000 and maybe 1 in 10,000 is the range we think of where we can detect it. Some facilities, we're pretty sure we've detected it from a single person, especially with the smaller sewer sheds.
As a scientist who is studying COVID-19 and its variants very closely, the speed of the spread of Omicron in Missouri is interesting to him. He says it's a lot like Delta.
In terms of how fast they swept the state, there wasn't that much difference between Delta and Omicron. Delta, within 3 or 4 weeks, had taken over the state. I will say that the spikes have been higher with Omicron. So we see Omicron move in, and with both Delta and Omicron, once we see them move in, we see a spike in the amount of RNA, we see a spike in the number of cases. But I will say with Omicron, that is definitely higher. But how fast it got through the state was fairly similar.
Due to all of Johnson's experiences, he advises that Omicron is not a variant to be messed with.
I have a friend who's a doctor, and he's like, yeah, that I went through the ICU, and every single one of the patients was someone, usually they have an underlying condition and they're unvaccinated. And this notion that this is a milder version of the virus is largely misunderstood. The average disease is milder. That's because the average person that's infected has pre-existing immunity. It's really not entirely clear yet whether this is truly milder than Delta in an apples to apples comparison, meaning if you are unvaccinated and get infected with Omicron, it's not really clear that it's that much milder than Delta. If you are unvaccinated and you have not been infected at this point, you need to be really, really careful because the chances of you getting infected anywhere you go are very high, much higher now than at any point in the pandemic up until now. However, if you are vaccinated, in particular if you are vaccinated and boosted, you might get infected and you might not like it, but you're not going to die. It is almost entire. If you go through any ICU, it's all unvaccinated people.